Thank you. Everybody have a good lunch? Yeah? You nice and full? Good. That's how I prefer my audiences, stuffed and sleepy. So I'd like to begin by confessing to you my deepest, most shameful secret. I don't know how to use PowerPoint. That's what we got. I don't have a slideshow, anything impressive like that. I have words, I have meaning. That's what you got from me. I'm Susanna, a stand-up comedian, storyteller, writer, performance provocateur, and artist using words as my medium. I've always talked too much, and now, on my best days, it's how I pay the bills. So, where does something like me come from? Like many of us, a mom and a dad. They contribute our genetic material and define what we see, shaping it into the world that we know. My mom was a strong woman, a Girl Scout troop leader with a big bohemian heart, ultra-liberal with an impressive collection of NPR fundraiser mugs and tote bags. My dad was larger than life, a super popular morning DJ and big personality, a folk hero. Paul Bunyan with a microphone. Everyone knew him and had a story about him. Dropping his name at the door got me into many a bar before I was 21. Watching the public respond to him was my first linking of humor to adoration. If you can make people come out of the depths of their own minds enough to laugh, they will love you forever. And I loved my parents, I did. I loved them, and they loved me too. I never ever doubted that. Not so much each other, though. Their relationship was tumultuous, a real roller coaster. I remember a lot of explosive anger and loud fighting from my childhood. In my house, piano benches were for throwing. That's how they would punctuate a point during an argument to let the other one know that they really meant what they just said. I could tell the magnitude of the argument by where the bench ended up. If it was merely knocked over, it was probably a mild storm, everything was probably fine. If it was thrown into the next room, there might be a few more days of thunder and lightning. And I know it could have been worse. I watched Law & Order SVU. I'm very aware that I grew up in a pretty tame version of what could have been, but there's a Mark Twain quote that's always stuck with me. A child's loss of a doll and a king's loss of a crown are events of the same size, which is applicable not just to loss, but to all emotions, including fear, meaning that their effect and intensity isn't quantified on a comparative scale to anyone else's experience, only how they resonate with us individually. So even though no one was getting choked or stabbed or thrown out of a 12-story window, again, like I said, lot of law and order, it was still tense and uncomfortable. It was an ongoing powder keg. I never knew when things were going to explode. I never knew who was coming home from work. Would it be angry dad? Would it be martyred but ready to fight mom? Would it be disengaged dad, happy mom? It was a lot to try and predict and prepare for and still get homework done. So despite how much I loved my parents, I couldn't wait to get away from the shaky ground. I think I'm the only kid in history that begged to go to military school. My dad made the mistake of threatening me with it once, and I just wouldn't let it go. You know, he said, if you don't buckle down and start doing things right, get the work done, you will end up in military school. And I said, can we just skip to that? Seriously, I brought home brochures. Though I can't imagine that I would have fared very well there, because although my parents were big on being mad and yelling, they were not big on discipline. Kind of the opposite, really. My parents trusted my judgment enough to let me not only run as wild as I wanted, but also to defend me whenever I was called into question. There were many assistant principals, counselors, and mall cops who ended up very sorry that they'd questioned my ethics, morality, or legality after the thorough verbal beating they took from my father for having tread on precious, irrepressible me. The only thing that I was ever officially punished for was lying. It was unacceptable. Top crime in our little micro-kingdom. I was grounded one time in my life, and it wasn't for staying out all night in dangerous places with dangerous people doing dangerous things, which is exactly what I was doing. I was punished for lying to my parents about it, for not having enough respect for them to allow them the chance to show me that they trusted me enough to explore life and still keep myself on the up and up, which they did. But dishonesty is disrespect. So when I was 20 and learned that my father had been having an affair for a few years, the hypocrisy hit me really hard, though I wasn't deep enough into myself to know that that was the reason. So I credited my anger to the pain he'd caused my mother, the betrayal of our family, which was scotch-taped together at best, and after I had my obligatory lifetime movie-level dramatic outburst, I refused to speak to him for about a year. When I let him back into my life, it was because my mother asked me to. She said it would make the divorce easier for her, but I kept him at arm's distance. It was like I'd fired an employee and hired him back as an outside consultant. You're back in the building, but your key card doesn't open the executive bathroom anymore. Don't get pissy that you're peeing with the administrative assistants. Just be happy that you're in the building at all. Our conversations were short and impersonal. We talked about work, the weather, movies, like first date conversations. We never discussed the rift. We just moved on from it reconnected, with me being a stubborn little apple fallen close to his prideful tree. In 1998, I was living in Chicago, he in Green Bay. He went to the doctor for a little bit of chest pain, and it turned out that he needed an emergency quintuple heart bypass. He had 5 arteries blocked over 80%. He called and told me, and I dropped everything to be there. Like literally. I hung up the phone, walked off of my job, got in my car, and drove the 5 hours, just because he needed me, just because he thought enough of me after everything to want me there, to find me comforting. After the surgery, he changed. He changed his whole life. It started with his diet, and it bled into everything. He was putting himself, his health, his happiness first, which is what we're supposed to do, right? And I resented the shit out of it. How dare he give up the quest for my exoneration when I still sought his approval? A few years later, when I got quickie married, I still made my near stranger groom-to-be call my dad and ask for my hand on the way to the Vegas wedding chapel. And as dated and misogynistic as that tradition is, I thought my dad would appreciate it, like halfway for humor's sake, we had the same sense of humor, but also out of that need for his approval, for him to say that what I was doing was okay, I wasn't heading down the wrong road. He did not give it, but I still said I do. Now, when I was writing this, I went online looking for the perfect transitional quote for this point in the story, and I found a million that all said basically the same thing, which is that without actively working for other outcomes, our relationships mimic what we see in our parents. And it's true. My own marriage was like a mirror of theirs, right down to my feelings of obligation to stick with it. Even though there were no children to use as the reason to avoid difficult change, I felt like my husband depended on me to keep him alive. And if I left, he would descend into something terrible and tragic that would, of course, be my fault for leaving. So I stayed, righteous and unhappy in my own martyrdom. And eventually, I too cheated. One time. And after it happened, I felt alive. You thought I was going to say something like terrible, right? No, I felt great. Like I hadn't felt for the whole 4 years I'd been married. I was singing in the shower afterwards, not balled up in a fetal position crying down the drain. And I know that makes me a monster, right? I know that you want to hear that I felt guilt and remorse, but I didn't for like 12 hours. And then yes, I felt every bit as bad as anyone who'd never walked a mile in those shoes would want me to. I felt trapped in an unfulfilling marriage, and I handled that by acting out in a selfish way that didn't actually solve the problem, but just gave me a moment's relief from the pain. It was like taking an Advil to put off getting the root canal. Sounds kind of familiar. Like maybe something I'd seen someone else do a few years previous, but refused to acknowledge this side of. Now, when I've told this story before, this is the point where I would start talking about finding compassion and recognizing my flawed judgment and forgiving my dad for his own horrible offense. But when I started working on it for this, the TED Talk, the big deal, there was something blocking me from sticking with that outcome. It was, as my good friend Ryan named it, my fraud alert. It kept going off. Ending there, saying that I forgave my dad, never felt right because it wasn't. I didn't forgive him. I hadn't forgiven him. I didn't even, at that point, see the parallel at the time. I was living in this constant crisis mode. I wasn't able to consider anything outside of the reality in which I was living. I hadn't gotten into yoga yet, so ego was just a word that I used as a way to sound intellectual and superior in arguments. I had no idea of its true meaning or influence. My husband never found out about my indiscretion, but we did end up getting divorced shortly after. We parted ways and we did not stay in touch. And life moved on Socratically unexamined. I moved on, and I moved out to Los Angeles. My relationship with my dad had continued to improve slowly, little steps. Now we chatted like work buddies. We would exchange funny stories. I'd ask him for business advice. We would talk about movies, books, TV, etc., casual stuff, other family members, and it worked for us. Then in the middle of the night, on July 29th, 2014, a man broke into my apartment and sexually assaulted me. You didn't see that coming, did you? Neither did I. After the chaos died down and the police left, I didn't know what else to do, so I called my dad. I had this primal need to feel safe, and something deep, deep, deep down inside me said that he was the one to call. I woke him up. It was like 6 a.m. his time. I told him what happened. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, I allowed him the opportunity to really be my dad, the same dad that he was when I had him up on a pedestal, the same dad he was before the fall. It was a very vulnerable moment to put down that arm's distance and hope that he was still willing to come close enough to take care of me. And he was. He put on the Superman cape, and he showed up like a motherfucker. And I apologize for my profanity. I think that the intensity of the story warrants it, and also, since he is technically my biological father, it is the correct term. I wasn't in a secure place financially, so he paid for me to move to a new safe apartment as soon as I found one. But more importantly than that, he showed up emotionally. He talked to me every day for as long as I needed. He was never too busy. Nothing came before me. He was the hero. And he remained that for me, even after life had resumed whatever normalcy was available. In April 2016, he died. It was unexpected, but I was able to be there by his side when he passed. And I spent that night in his home office looking through his stuff. I knew my dad loved me. Like I said in the beginning, I never had any doubt, but I was still surprised by what I found. He had everything. Everything. He had every article ever written about me. He had every interview I'd ever done. He had every picture. Even ones that weren't of me, even ones that I had just funny ones, the things I'd posted on Facebook, he'd saved to his desktop. He loved that I'd branched into storytelling, and I found a file on his computer where he'd started writing his own story in hopes of telling it at the Moth, that hugely popular mammoth storytelling event. My heart broke. It just broke that night. It broke open. And everything ugly inside it fell out for me to see right in the midst of this shrine to what he saw as my greatness. It said that the death of ego is the birth of clear vision. And in that moment, I realized that my dad did not deserve my forgiveness. He deserved my apology. He did everything he could to show me how much he loved me, how sorry he was for any pain he caused, which was never his intention. Something I could have understood, something that I should have understood if I would have had any self-awareness at the time. He never left, even when I pushed him away. Even when I had the opportunity to understand, to acknowledge, to heal our shared wounds, I didn't. And any measure of guilt that I'd ever felt in my life didn't compare in the slightest to what I felt in that moment. And I couldn't apologize. He was gone. All I could do was sit with the guilt. So that's what I did. I sat right there. I sat on the wood floor of his office until after sunrise, thinking and crying and feeling everything. There's another Mark Twain quote that I love. Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. I found that fragrance, that peace, in the moments between the pain, when the memories would pop up. Me riding on the back of his motorcycle to his favorite hamburger place. Us going to the park so I could climb the trees with the branches low enough for me to reach. Me and my dad breaking into an abandoned amusement park to take pictures. And I'm sorry to bust out the big cliches at such an intense point in my talk. But the only thing that quelled the pain of guilt was acknowledging his love for me, his constant support and involvement, that ego wouldn't let me acknowledge face to face when I had the chance. He loved me. He loved me despite my flaws, my shitty behavior. And when you truly love someone, you don't want them to suffer. He wanted me to be happy, which, as we all know from a million articles and other TED Talks and Instagram yoga posts, has to start with self-love. The only way I could atone, the only way I could make amends to him was to let him win this battle and love myself the way I only then realized that he did and wanted me to, unconditionally. You can't love and hold a grudge at the same time, so I had to start working on it. I had to start working on myself, making choices that I felt he would have wanted me to. Ones that were productive and pushed me towards being someone that we could both have been proud of. Trying really hard to shy away from what's just immediately gratifying, which is very hard. You know, I had to start self-parenting at the age of 40, and sometimes I failed, and sometimes I fail, because my inner child is loud and whiny and wants candy, not vegetables. Achieving self-love and forgiveness to become the most complete people we can be, to put all of our puzzle pieces together in the right order so that we are what's pictured on our individual boxes, requires letting go of the crosses that we carry. But as with parenting, if you don't address bad behavior, if you just brush it under the rug, you're going to raise a serial killer. Again, SVU. So it's with love that we need to hold ourselves accountable for the things we've done in the past that have hurt others, that have shaken up their puzzle boxes. So I started thinking about my past, and my marriage came up, a little bit unresolved. So I posted on Facebook looking for a long-lost phone number, and 10 minutes later, I am on the phone with my ex-husband. Oddly enough, he didn't sound too happy to hear from me. So I started rambling out of nervousness, and then out it came. I said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for so much, but most of all for not loving you the way you deserved to be loved. I know you were doing your best, and I'm so sorry I didn't recognize that. I want to acknowledge that I do now, and thank you for trying so hard. Also, I'm not sober. This isn't one of those AA fifth step calls. This is from the heart. He was silent for a minute, and then he thanked me. And then we had the best, most honest conversation we'd ever had. And when we hung up, I felt this amazing sense of calm and lightness, like one of my own puzzle pieces had resettled inside me in the right spot. And I realized that ego is a tricky bitch. Ego makes you think you're looking out a window, judging your neighbor, but when you start operating from your true self, you realize that that window is actually a mirror, and all that shit you're looking at judgmentally isn't outside at all. The calls are coming from inside the house, and that house is messy. I've been cleaning mine for over a year now, and though it's been uncomfortable and really embarrassing at times, I've never been more sure that I'm doing the right thing. Ending things is always the hardest part for me, because who am I to tell you what to take away, what meaning to find in anything? My intention is that you find something valuable in what I've said, and if it's about forgiveness, or ego, or love, or apologies, or not sitting stubbornly in anger, letting precious time pass, or even just not titling your TED Talk before you write it, then I feel like I've done something worth the price of your admission. Thank you.